It is true. I actually, it's great to be here, by the way. I live in Johns Creek, so it's not that far, so it's really nice. You'll see me every now in Avalon picking up a pizza or something like that. I did study econ as an undergrad. That was my major. And I took that econ degree and I became a pastor. And so after graduating from college in the States, I moved to Korea. I was a pastor at a Presbyterian church. And the Presbyterian church was in Seoul, Korea. And on Sunday, they had every Sunday about 30,000 people. Like, no joke, 30,000 people. It wasn't even the biggest Presbyterian church in the city. There was a bigger one than ours. And just for Korea in Seoul, just imagine Manhattan, but 3 times more dense, literally. Sky rises everywhere. And so I was a pastor and I got an MDiv, went to seminary. I took that MDiv and I became a financial analyst in the Silicon Valley. I did 3 years of ministry. I said, I'm gonna take a little break from that. I went back home to California and I got a finance job. And I did that job for 4 years. And there came a time where I decided I don't want to do finance anymore. I didn't enjoy it. And I got married. My wife asked, if you were to have guaranteed success from God in any vocation, what would you do? And I said, I think I'd probably try to be a biblical scholar. Like, seminary, I really enjoyed it. I think I'd be pretty good. And then she said, well, why don't you do it? And I said, okay, and I quit my job. And after 7 short years of graduate school, I became a professor. And I moved from an analyst in the Silicon Valley to a Bible scholar. Obviously, I'm a terrible financial analyst. At the time when I was in the industry, this was in the Valley, and so there was a small startup that was trying to do a simplified search engine. The startup name was Google. At the time, that was 1998 when they went public. And so I made my questionable vocational decisions, but I'm very delighted to be here. You know, I listened to the video of your sermon last Sunday just to get a sense of the church. And I got the news about me coming. And I think, to just be very honest, it was overplayed because we actually don't know how the canon came to be. We really don't know. There aren't minutes. They weren't Presbyterians at the time. We don't have meticulous records. We don't know exactly how these books came to be, but we have a little bit of evidence. And so that's kind of what I want to share, what we know. And my hope is that this will help you understand the Bible in different ways, bring different sorts of meaning. I think, like I said, I grew up in the Methodist church, and in college I kind of found myself in a Presbyterian church. And in seminary, was really drawn to Reformed theology in certain ways. And so I think there are ways we think about the shaping of the canon that could help us appreciate certain themes that are prominent in a Presbyterian church, like the idea of sovereign God and the idea of God working despite of us. We're still in God's image, but God works in tremendous ways despite of us. I think kind of also realizing the finiteness that we hold as humans is really pretty prominent as we think about the canon. And to think about the canon, it's not just what books we select. I think you need to think deeper than that in things on like literacy. How the Bible became to be is very related to how we understand literacy. So I'm going to give you a quiz right now. We have 3-question quiz. The question, I'm going to give you 3 passages, and in your mind, I want you to think, is this in the canon or not in the canon? And so I'll read these for you. Question number 1, and these, I will say one hint, I haven't made any of these up. These are actual texts of antiquity. So you have to decide canon or not canon. The first one, Omri was king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab many days, for Chemosh was angry with his land, and his son succeeded him. And he also said, I will oppress Moab. In my days he said so, but I looked down on him and on his house. So does that sound like something you've read in the Bible? Question number 2. It's going to keep in your head a little bit and stuff. Question number 2. Now my children, show zeal for the law and give your lives for the covenant of our ancestors. Remember what our ancestors did in their generations, and you shall receive great glory and an everlasting name. Okay, think in yourself. Is this in the canon? Question number 3, the last one. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am in distress. Deliver me from the hand of the wicked, from the hand of those who plot evil against me. Let them be ashamed who rise against me unjustly, but let your servant rejoice in your mercy. Is that in the canon? Okay, so they all should sound kind of familiar, at least in style. But the first one, someone already said, I'll read again. Omri was king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab many days, for Chemosh was angry with his land, and his son succeeded him. And he also said, I will oppress Moab. In my days he said so, but I looked down on him and on his house. And someone kind of shared, this is similar to the Bible, but it's not from the Bible. It's not in the canon. This is from something called the Moabite stone. And this was discovered in Jordan in the 19th century during the time when there's a lot of exploration. It actually has language that resembles 1st and 2nd Kings. Instead, it's not written by Israelites, it's written by Canaanites. So I actually give this quiz to my students, and these are seminarians, but I replace Moab with Israel, and I replace Israel with Moab. And instead of Chemosh, I say Yahweh. So I'm kind of tricking them. And these are seminarians, but over a third of them guess that this is part of the Bible. And actually with good reason. 1st and 2nd Kings takes from this type of language. This is a huge basalt inscription. It's sitting in the Louvre, but there are copies all over the place, including at Emory. If you want to see some, there's actually a kind of an Indiana Jones story where someone stole it. People were chasing him, and they were breaking it into 4 pieces because they could sell it to more. Eventually, they put it back. And so this is also from the time of Israel. This is probably from the 9th century, found in Jordan. And you can see the language being very, very similar. The second question, now my children, show zeal for the law and give your lives for the covenant of our ancestors. Remember what our ancestors did in their generations, and you shall receive great glory and an everlasting name. Is this in the canon or not? Well, kind of. It's in a book called First Maccabees. And you might see this in your NRSV as part of something called the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical. And so the Presbyterian Church doesn't consider this in the canon, considers it helpful, but some of the Orthodox churches, the Catholic Church considers this as part of the canon. So right away, this problematizes the question, is it in the canon or not? Yes, for some. And of course, if we believe the Bible is scripture, that has big repercussions. So in most Protestant traditions, this is not in the canon, but helpful, because this is a text which is kind of in between the Testaments, written in Greek about this revolt of the Jews against the empire in the 2nd century BC. We know a lot about the intertestamental period because of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The third question, and that's actually a picture of Maccabees from a printed Bible from a while back. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am in distress. Deliver me from the hand of the wicked, from the hand of those who plot evil against me. Let them be ashamed who rise against me unjustly, but let your servant rejoice in your mercy. This is actually a psalm, but it's not in the canon. This is a psalm found in this cave near the Dead Sea, Cave 11, and this is actually what it looks like. You might hear this as the great psalm squirrel, but we actually have all these psalms that we read for the first time in the 20th century, but they date from the 1st century broadly. And so these are psalms that this Jewish community considered important for some reason, and they kept them, but we had no idea that they existed. And there's so many psalms. In fact, if you look at this cave and a few other caves, mainly Cave 4, you have about 1,000 examples of biblical texts. And what are the most frequent texts in these caves? The book of Isaiah, the Psalms, Deuteronomy, in the caves near the Dead Sea. What are the 3 most quoted Old Testament texts in the New Testament? The book of Isaiah, the Psalms, Deuteronomy. That tells us something about canon, what they considered, this group considered Psalms, Isaiah, Deuteronomy to be really, really important, and so does the New Testament. But this particular psalm didn't make it in our collection of 150 for some reason. There are multiple psalms that we're just reading for. The form is the same. It looks like a psalm. It is a psalm. It just isn't a psalm that's somehow kept within the canon of the Bible that we have. So how did that happen? Not sure, but here are some clues to think through this. I want you to think like go back, like way back, like way, way back before the time of writing. And just imagine your life if you didn't know how to read or write. And think about and kind of guess in Old Testament times, what percentage of the people knew how to read? What percent? And so nobody knows for sure, but most guesses about 1 to 3% knew how to read. So how do you get information? You're not scrolling on your phones, you're not looking at a computer, but information was passed to you through generational descent. And so for most of human history, you would live with your siblings and your cousins on your father's side. And the eldest son on that side would live with grandparents. If you were a woman, when you get married, probably 15, you would move to your husband's side of the family. And narratives and stories were passed down patrilineally. So the father's father would sit down and share stories about ancestry, but also stories about their origins and about faith. So this is how we got so much information. It's through oral tradition. And so orality is a huge thing for most of human history. And there are seeds of that today. I will say I teach young people, and a lot of them have a lot of interest in their narrative. And a lot of it comes out in their early 20s. Like they didn't care so much as a 14-year-old or 15-year-old, but then they come to college, they kind of think about themselves, they learn a little bit about history, they read some poetry, and they have broader questions about ancestry. And it's fascinating how proud and how thoughtful they are and how amazed that they are in kind of following the lives of those that have passed long before them. This happened to me actually 2 weeks ago, where I was at home. I'm from San Francisco. I was home with my mom and my brother, and my dad's youngest brother was there. So of that generation, a lot of my uncles and aunts have passed, but he is the one that's left. And he was sharing stories. I did not know this, but my grandmother and grandfather, who I never got to meet, they have a grave in Korea. It's a family grave. And so all these generations of noms are there. And my uncle actually has been paying the last 20 years for a caretaker to take care of the grave, which is a very Korean thing. He showed me where it was, and it's just kind of what happens. You hear from your father's side stories about your ancestry. And so the Bible is actually a pretty radical technology against that. Imagine if everything you knew about God's narratives were passed down by your father's father, eventually to your father, and then to you. Or some of you, by your husband's father. That is the source of these narratives. And you can see how they become very valuable, but also they can be subject to change at certain moments depending on the grandfather in charge. So writing kind of sets things in different ways, the solidity. But writing is not something that was invented. Like the joke I have is people will ask when was writing invented? I say January 1st, 3200 BC, 12:01 a.m. is when writing was invented. Writing actually has pre-writing for thousands of years. And so before writing, and that's about when writing began. And what's super interesting, it emerged in two different civilizations independent of each other. So in China and in Sumer, in Mesopotamia. But before, like thousands of years before writing, there was pre-writing. So one example is just having these kind of patterns on a ceiling, and you would put this on what here is a type of rolling seal that you do to seal a jar or a document, or a jar or a cave or a storage thing, and it shows that this is official, whatever that means. It wouldn't have writing because it hasn't been invented, but it'd be some sort of pattern, a pattern that's human-made. And that was to kind of guarantee authenticity, guarantee counts. Another example, 1,000 years before writing, is beads and tokens. So why was writing invented? Not for stories, not for narratives, it was for accounting that they invented writing. It became too much to count on your fingers when civilization got bigger. And so you would do things, get kind of this clay ball and stick these beads inside. So 6 beads would be 6 units of this project. 12 beads would be 12 units, whatever the unit would be. And you would seal it and sometimes make indentations. Though this isn't quite writing, but this is pre-writing. And this was existing for 1,000 years before the actual emergence of writing. And then eventually you have writing onto clay. So these things, you would have a picture of a sun, and that would be simplified, and that would be the language for God or the sun. You have a picture of a river, and that would be simplified. And eventually this became more and more prevalent. And you had the emergence of this cuneiform writing. So these are tablets, and they're tiny. And this one was actually found in Jerusalem. And it dates from probably about the time of what you would consider Moses, like 1200 BC. And this is written in a language related to Hebrew. But if you ever work with pottery, when the clay gets to what they call a leathery feel, you can have indentations on it. And these indentations are representative of writing. And then you bake these, and they become as solid as hockey pucks. I've never actually touched a hockey puck. I'm from California, but that's what they tell me. They're as solid as hockey pucks, which is great because they last. And right now, we actually have hundreds and thousands and 10,000s and hundreds of thousands and over 1 million examples of this writing. Most of them are untranslated. And also, remember, writing was invented for economic purposes. These are pretty boring, like 6 donkeys, 3 jars of wine. That's the majority of writing, like 99%. With AI, you could actually translate these with like shocking accuracy now. You scan them and you translate them. And so we'll see how much emerges, because so many of these are stuck in museums, private collections. Even a few years ago, someone was studying this in the British Museum. It's never been on display. It was in their archives. They were studying this, and they found a name of someone mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. And this was actually from a tablet from the time of Jeremiah. And so eventually this becomes the type of writing. Now, the problem of this is not like English. It's not an alphabet. The alphabet is a totally different thing. These are pictograms, similar to Chinese, maybe. And so it's really hard to learn how to read and write. Scribes were in scribal schools for 20 years with an apprentice as they learned how to write. So writing became very rare, and it wasn't actually until much later where they invented the alphabet. And so this is something else found in Israel, and this is found what they called Iron Age 1. This is the time of the judges. So what do you remember about the time of the judges? There's no king. They're a bunch of like regional judges or leaders. They're all warring with each other. They're all kind of sometimes colluding to go against, people outside that are warring with them. And so it's really chaotic. And so within this Iron Age period, they did make a few finds, and a lot of them, like 5 or 6, are on arrowheads. And so on the arrowheads is writing in alphabet, and it's kind of in this kind of proto-Hebrew, I would call it. Like, this is like pre-Hebrew. And you could read them, and what does it say on them? It says names. It's just like John Smith, but Hebrew names in there. And so the question scholars ask is, why would you put names on arrowheads? And so I actually pose this to students, and the students give all sorts of answers. One, like, once you shoot it, you want to catch yours, retrieve yours. Like, okay. Sometimes people think people are bored. There's a lot of downtime in war, so people just kind of write those. Okay, that assumes that the soldiers know how to write. Most of the guesses, as these arrowheads were never used in battle, they were used in ceremony. And so when you are fighting in the ancient world, a lot of times, if you interview people that have actually served in combat, whether you live or die seems random, especially with arrows. They fall on you or they don't. The person next to you might get struck with an arrow, but you might not. And so before they went off to war, they had a religious ritual. So the idea is this writing is attached with religious ritual to protect them when they go to war. And you actually, if you compare that with Amos 1-2, if you remember the book of Amos, there are all these condemnations against the enemies of Israel. And it kind of feels almost like a pre-war ritual that they're taking that genre. And then Amos does something funny. It actually condemns Judah in the middle and Israel for that. They're condemning themselves. And so writing in this case is probably somewhat rare, because they're using it for a ritual. There's something magical about that when people have the ability to write. If 99% of the world is illiterate, and this time it's probably 99.9% of the world is illiterate, and you see writing and people reading from that, it's going to mean something different for the writing. We'll get to the 10th century. So this is now the time of David and Solomon. And Israel is the single most excavated land in all the world. In all the world. They excavate that. It's a huge part of tourism. And the 10th century is really important because this is the time of David and Solomon, right? You go to the entire land of Israel, all the excavations, up until 2006. This was the only example of writing ever found before 2006. This is called the Gezer calendar. So you remember a city called Gezer in the Bible. It's written on limestone. If you're familiar with limestone, it's actually easy to scratch things on and off. It's not as hard as like basalt. And so you can just get a stylus and chisel in there. And if you read this text, this is also in a kind of pre-Hebrew. It's a calendar of agriculture. And it says things like 2 months of sowing, 2 months of reaping, some summer fruit, some grain, some flax, some barley. It talks about a regular 12-month season in agriculture for a field, a very diversified field. And one of the ideas for this text is really small. You know, it's on display in Jerusalem right now. What they did, because it's limestone, they probably used this as some other type of magic ritual. And so before a harvest, before a planting, so what any farmer will tell you, no matter how hard you work on a field, you're dependent on God. You need rain. No matter how hard you work, if there's no rain, there's going to be no harvest. You need protection from pestilence. You could have a beautiful looking crop and you could be harvesting in a week, but then you could be taken out by locusts. So even no matter how hard you work, there's a sense of faith on God. So the idea that they had some sort of ritual before the harvest, before the planting, that would kind of ensure favor of the gods for harvest. And this is meaningful because also there's no money at the time. There's no invention of coinage yet. There's no invention, so you cannot store things. So your wealth is dependent on the harvest that you can store. So maybe some things could last another year, but multiple years of famine, of no harvest, will wipe you out and your family will be starving. And so when you talk about faith in God, you have to have faith in God with the harvest. And the estimate in ancient Israel, for every 10 years for a farmer, roughly 3 had 0 harvest. So this was a regular cycle of them to have 0 harvest. That's why they had to store things. That's why themes of famine are very prominent. It's not hyperbole. It's real famine that happened in this land. So this tends to take writing in sort of this magical way in some sort of ritual before harvest. So in 2006, this was discovered. And this was Tel Zayat. It's a place pretty close to Jerusalem, the Shephelah, the lowlands, where they actually excavated this for several weeks, meaning all these workers, volunteers, students are coming and excavate. And the last day is when you always find things, because the last day is when they actually stop shoveling and they take brushes and they start to clean these places off. And once you clean them, you can begin to see things. And you clean them, then you take final pictures of excavation. And so a college kid was cleaning this section and he saw these scratches on rocks, no big deal, scratches all the time, but they looked like a pattern. So he called his area supervisor, and the area supervisor called the dig director, and they realized this college kid had discovered the second example of writing in Israel in all of the 10th century. So this is what's called an abecedary, and it is literally like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, except in Hebrew, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, and so just someone writing the alphabet. But what's also interesting, it's written on the stone that has an altar on the top, and it's about 30 kilos heavy. And there's another writing that says to Baal on the stone. And in the alphabet, it reverses the known orders. So instead of A, B, C, D, it'd be something like A, B, D, C. And it's written in pretty good script, so it's a scribe. And so the person probably knew the alphabet, but they were intentionally mixing the order in a few places, in 4 different places. So why would you do that? Well, the clue is because it's on an altar, it could have been on some sort of ritual, some sort of different magic ritual as well. And then a few years later, they found the 3rd example of writing. And so this is all we have right now, 3 examples of writing in the 10th century. This is an ostraca, which means there's a potsherd, and this is in a place called Kirbet Kayafa. And the potsherd has written in ink different things, and it's very little. One controversy, it might mention Gath, which is pretty close, like Gath of the Philistines, but it's really hard to understand this. So what does this tell us about literacy, and what does this tell us about canon? It tells us if all of the 10th century, this is all you have, there's very, very little writing, and people aren't that literate. And so there probably isn't a lot of need for sacred texts at this time if nobody knows how to read them. And this is literacy, but it's not like one's an alphabet. One's a little bit of a narrative that we can't read. One's a magic calendar. When literacy is rare, it tends to have some sort of numinous properties. People look at writing with some sort of awe, with some sort of deep understanding that maybe there's something powerful in that. So for at least 2 of these texts, the writing is incorporated in some sort of ritual, some sort of way in which they try to invoke the power of the god. So that's the 10th century. Let's go to the 9th century. You actually have a few more examples, but not that many. And this is the most famous. There was an archaeologist named Avi Biran, and in Israel, military service is mandatory. These archaeologists are pretty chiseled and hardened. And so he was in his 70s, and he's a pretty well-known archaeologist, but he's giving this interview, and he's saying, I'm already in my 70s. I'll probably never find anything of note. A few years later, he was the director of a place called Tel Dan. And so in the Bible, you hear about Dan. It's the really north part of Israel, beautiful place. And he's excavating there, and he found this kind of walkway, and they're flipping the stones. And he flipped this right stone, and you see this is written in Aramaic. And they're reading this, and if you see this highlighted text right here, it literally says in Aramaic, you could hear quickly, Beit David, which is the translation for House of David. So this is the only reference we have to David during the time of the biblical world that we have. And he just found this in his 70s. After being quoted, I'm never going to find anything special. He found this in the 70s. And they flipped it and found this. In the next season, they flipped every other rock. And they found 2 more pieces of that to put this together to have this inscription. So this is written. It's very strong. You see this in Israel. It actually has traveled to the States as well. Maybe 15 years ago, it made a tour of the United States. But this is basically an Aramaean king. The Israelites had problems with the Arameans in the north, and he's bragging that he defeated the house of David. And this is pretty important because at the time, scholarship was emerging that David was fictitious. And if anything, he was a chiefdom tribal leader. And then you have this really famous king writing, I defeated David. So what does it tell people? You're not going to brag about defeating a small tribal leader. You brag about defeating a king. And what's also interesting is because this was found in secondary use. So we didn't find it monumented. It originally was, so you could see it's part of a torso. And it was probably part of this huge statue of this king that has this inscription, and this is what they did, all the people they defeated. So what happened was they destroyed that monument and used it to build another pathway instead of quarrying their own rock. And so we know it's found in secondary use, meaning it's pretty old. It probably dates from pretty close to the time of David, now probably by the 9th century. So it's a really amazing find, but if you look at all the 9th century finds, there are just a few, more than 3, but not that many. So it also tells me literacy is rare. And because this is found on a big torso, it wasn't meant for people to read, but for people to be impressed by. Like, wow, this is amazing. This is an incredible king. And some scribe that worked for the king would, like a press secretary would say, look, he defeated the house of David and all these other polities. And so that was what writing was. Rare, literacy was small. And then you get to the 8th century. That's the signal for the house of David right there. You get to the 8th century, and suddenly in the 8th century, hundreds and hundreds of examples of writing. 10th, 3 examples. 9th, a little bit more than 3. 8th century, hundreds and hundreds of examples in Israel of writing, which tells us that literacy is beginning to flourish. And what do we know about Israel in the 8th century from at least biblical texts? This is the time of Hezekiah, when he's unifying the kingdom, the southern kingdom, against the Assyrian invaders. And so there's so many examples of writing, and not just one median, not just one inscription, not just one big monument, not just one, but all sorts of things. So this one here is inside a cave, ink on plaster. and they actually found all the plaster on the ground, and they had to reassemble it to kind of get this writing. It mentions the prophet of Balaam in this. So it's pretty interesting from a biblical perspective. This one is found in the desert, and you actually see pictures of these bovines, and you have writing that says Yahweh and his Asherah. So in this portion in the desert, there was polytheistic worship. Yahweh had a wife for this community. This here is found in Samaria. They found these pot shards in the early 20th century, and when you go into archaeology, you find pottery, you soak it in water for 24 hours, then you brush it, and then when they started brushing it, writing started to appear. So they went through all the pottery, and they ended up finding over 100 pieces of writing that talk about olive oil and fine wine, just those two things, and distribution of olive oil and fine wine. This is from a place in Arad, which talks about, it mentions Edomites, it's a military outpost. They talk about military news like, oh no, they're coming after us, or please send more supplies. This here was interesting because it was found in the middle of a water cistern, and it talks about the water cistern, and this is what's found in Jerusalem. It allowed for fresh water to come into Jerusalem within the city walls. And what's interesting, it's written in really good Hebrew. So this is likely written by someone from northern Israel that fled when the Assyrians took over, found themselves in Jerusalem, and was used to just dig through bedrock. And they actually dug through bedrock to find each other, to let this water flow, and it commemorates that. This is a letter from the second most important city in the Bible named Lachish. And what's interesting about this is there's a letter. They wrote these letters on ink to and from these pieces of pottery. And in this letter, it's written to a junior military officer. And it says something like, I don't need a scribe. Why would you suggest that I need a scribe? And so what does that say about literacy? It's not like a general. It's more like maybe a captain. And he's bragging that I know how to read and write. I don't need a scribe. I could write this by myself. So that tells us there's an expectation of literacy, at least among low junior officers. It turns out his writing wasn't that good, but we can still read it. But that is so different from we know about the 9th century and 10th century. When only a few knew how to write, literacy is flourishing. And why does literacy flourish? Again, for economic reasons. Hezekiah was there, and he's the one that had to do administration beyond your fingers. And so he set forth scribal schools, and he had people learn how to write so they can administer, distribute goods in the right way. A lot of these have to do with that. And also with the rise of literacy, religious literacy came up as well. And so think about the prophets. When does written prophecy start? It starts during the time of Hezekiah with Amos and Isaiah and Hosea and Micah. And this is when religious texts really begin to come and flourish. So they happened before, but they really start to flourish in the 8th century. We know prophecy was earlier. We know some traditions were earlier. But what this writing does is taking those traditions and writing them down. And so there are some clues in the Bible that lead us to think about both the oral, then written nature of the Bible. It goes through some of the transformation. So in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books, most of the writing, most of the reference, there's very little reference to written books, except the exception would be Deuteronomy. But a lot of it kind of gives the seeds of an oral culture. So some examples, Genesis 49, then Jacob, who's really old at this time, called his sons and said, gather around that I may tell you what will happen to you in days to come. So he's not sharing a document. He's not sharing a census or registry. He's saying, come here and let me tell you. And Jacob is, close to death. So the sons are grown men at this time. So he's sharing a legacy. And this time it's what will happen to you in days to come. Exodus 15. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord, I will sing to the Lord. There's no reference to writing. It's something very oral that's done. And tradition is also given up to the children in worship now. And so Exodus 15 is a really interesting text because it's written in Hebrew, it's poetic, but we know you don't see this from the English, but the Hebrew is actually very, very old. It would be the equivalent of reading normal 21st century English than seeing some Shakespearean English right in the middle. It's deliberately very old and archaic. And so one example is, that song, my dad's favorite hymn when he was alive was How Great Thou Art. And he didn't speak English that well, but just think about the language, how great thou art. That's not how you speak today. But he kind of fossilizes these old terms. And this is what Exodus 15 does. It takes this old tradition, and the language doesn't match the Bible, but it actually matches, remember that clay tablet? The time of Moses. That is what it matches. So the idea that this is some sort of hymn they did to celebrate from the time of Moses that got passed down orally, like How Great Thou Art did, and then finally was written down in Exodus 15. And it's very explicit. They're singing this. They're using this in some sort of liturgy. In Deuteronomy 6:4, the most famous passage of something called the Shema, Lord the God of all heart, soul, and mind, it begins, "Hear, O Israel," not read, not study, but just to hear. This idea of people in charge are going to tell you what to do, and you are to hear the Lord our God, the Lord alone, or God is one, depending how you translate. So there's a deep oral culture in the earlier parts of the Old Testament, but you get to later parts of the Old Testament. Proverbs 25:1. These are the other Proverbs of Solomon that the officials of King Hezekiah of Judah copied. So this is explicit that their Proverbs are pithy. You could memorize them, and they're oral. But at some time in the 8th century, this is sharing us with these Proverbs that are circulated. The scribes, the officials of Hezekiah, were now going to write them down. And then eventually they will form part of the book of Proverbs. A very scribal culture is emerging. Chronicles, one of the last books written in the Bible. So all Israel was enrolled by genealogies, which is written, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. It's really rare to get reference to another written book in the Bible, but it happens multiple times in Chronicles. And if you've read the book of Chronicles, chapter 1 through 9 is the most boring Bible you've ever read, and it's 9 chapters of names. That's all it is, which also signals something scribal, that the writing of the names is really important. In Ezra 1:1, in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also in written edict declared. So the word of the Lord is now associated with Jeremiah, which at this time is now a written prophet. Jeremiah had died over 100 years earlier, but his prophecies have circulated by writing. And so this is what's being fulfilled, not an old prophet who says something, but a written prophet of someone who died a long time ago, circulated by writing. And also it makes reference to a written edict. And so you get this idea that written culture is becoming much more important, and it stabilizes the Word of God in certain ways. And so out of this emerges biblical texts. And in your Bibles, you have a certain order. In the Jewish Bibles, it's the exact same words, but in different order. It's divided in 3 ways, and this is ways that we could think of canonization. Torah is the very beginning. It was probably the earliest that was canonized. When I say canonized, reached to a state of very sacred space without people coming in and out. And so even in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, there's reference to a book of Torah. Almost all other references in the Bible just say Torah, and it's oral. But in Nehemiah 8, it's a written book. You know what they do? So Presbyterians, they preach a long time. I'm Presbyterian pastor, I know. And so in Nehemiah 8, they have this book for the first time. They just read it for 3 hours, and everybody is listening to that. And you just imagine. But imagine in your entire life, no matter how young or old you are, you've never seen or heard the Bible, ever. And then you hear it for the first time. That's what's happening. They find this book of the law after building the temple, after building the walls, and they want to celebrate. And for the first time, reading and hearing the Bible for the first. So it says actually very explicit in Nehemiah 8 that all the men, women, and children heard this, all who had ears to hear. And so Torah was probably the first to get to that canonized status. Prophets stand to both the former and latter prophets. And when you say prophets, not someone who predicts, that's not exactly what prophecy is. Prophecy is speaking on behalf of God, the word of God. And so it counts Joshua through 2 Kings. It's called the older or the former prophets. And the 4 books of the latter prophets, the 4 books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12. And actually, they're all about the same length, right? They're all about the same lengths. And so those reach some sort of canonical status, people guess, about the 2nd century BC, somewhat. And then the writings is everything else. Psalms, Job, Daniel, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. And this did not receive canonical status of probably the 2nd century, about the 2nd century CE. And we know this because of what I showed you. By the time of Qumran, there are still Psalms that people are disputing. And so what we do know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, Psalm 1 through 89 is pretty fairly solid at the time. But everything from Psalm 90 to 150 is very much in flux. And so that's just something from the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So how did this actually become canon? You can kind of follow that. We don't know, but here are some clues that we have. What brought for canonical recognition? And this was done by Jewish communities and later by Christian communities. If it had some sort of claim of Moses or prophetic origin, that was one way that things kind of made it to the canon. And we know that because people started faking prophetic origin in ways as well. There are different letters that didn't make it to the canon, and people knew that this is one way to get some sort of legitimacy. Torah is often considered the centerpiece. So if there's some sort of theological consistency with Torah or the first 5 books of the Bible, then that would be considered. That would be one factor. Enduring use in worship and teaching. And so do we see these cited a lot? We don't actually have any copy of the Bible till AD 1000, a complete copy. But we have lots of quotes from both early Christian fathers and through the early rabbis as well. So enduring use in worship and teaching and moral and spiritual impact, and communal recognition over time. There was never one big general assembly when they said, these are the books, and that's it. That didn't happen until much later in the Council of Trent for the Catholic Church, but it was over time. And canon was discerned and not declared. And it surely happened over many centuries of time when these books eventually emerged as this is what is going to be considered canonical, at least for the Jewish faith and also for Protestant faith. And Catholicism and Orthodox, they expanded it a little bit more. They made it official in the Middle Ages, but it eventually came to be. And you can kind of see guesses on when authors quote this, whether rabbis or early Christian fathers, why they considered these things to be. They're either theologically very powerful, or they generate some sort of questions, or they were quoted again in use of worship, like the Psalms, for example. There's probably a reason, you know how you print the Psalms a lot for worship, for liturgy. That's part of the reason why scribes wrote them all the time. And what's amazing is it follows multiple generations. What are the needs of biblical texts before the time of Christ? Judaism was a tiny brand. It was persecuted deeply by the Greeks and then by the Romans. What types of psalms emerge as powerful? So half of the psalms are lament psalms, but you can see how this is going to be meaningful for us because we're homeless and we're suffering, and we need a God that understands and can hear the suffering in our liturgy, in our very liturgy. Why are texts in the Bible so deeply about this marginalized Israel, who's a tiny little group of runaways from Egypt? Because you yourselves are runaways from Egypt. Why did Esther emerge when she is a woman who has no power in the midst of this gigantic empire? Because the Jews at the time feel like that as well. And you can see how that can transport to the early Christian church, which was a total small renegade, persecuted religion until Constantine in the 4th century. These texts are so powerful, so heavy for these people, and it's really kind of beautiful. By reading the canon today, you kind of can get a sense of why these persecuted communities in early Judaism and early Christianity found a God that met them in their place, in their time, and welcomed them with suffering, and didn't be Pollyannish with their lives, recognize the suffering, but also something stronger in the end. This is something especially powerful when I'm from Johns Creek. I teach usually pretty well-off students at Emory University, undergrads, Candler students, and I'm here in Alpharetta. I'm new because I only came here 5 years ago. I heard Alpharetta wasn't always like this. That's what they tell me, but I know the community is now pretty good, and the neighbors are pretty good. It's nice, and I think it's so valuable for you to really go into the world of those with nothing, and those with no power, and those that are persecuted, and to read the Bible through those lens, because I know that's also your experience too. That's part of the human condition of suffering. And I know oftentimes material wealth is just a vague veil across deep troubles that go on within. And I think that's a beautiful part of the canon. I also think what that does for me, we just don't know. I think that knowledge is hidden for us. So for me, to look at these texts with humility, and I studied the Bible a lot, I teach the Bible, but there are certain texts that I just don't understand. There are certain texts I don't understand grammatically. This doesn't make sense. But more than that, there are texts I don't understand theologically. And so I just finished, I wrote a couple of books on Ezra and Nehemiah. There's one section in Nehemiah 9, Nehemiah 13, Ezra 10, where they take all the Israelite women that married foreigners and they send them off with their children. They send them off in a triumphant way. I could see how that fits into the narrative. I understand because I have immigrant parents that really wanted us to marry Korean. I understand that. But there's also something that is very troubling about that. And I think understanding the development of canon, there's something beyond our understanding as there is with the text. And to really kind of think through, how did this make it? What is it about Ezra and Nehemiah that was powerful to people at the time? I think there's some act of faith that I tell my boys, like, I can't give you an academic reason why I'm a Christian. I've been given the gift of faith, and for some reason, I just believe. And I know some people wrestle with that, and I totally acknowledge that. It just, for some reason, it wasn't something I ever dealt with, even in childhood. I never questioned the ability of God, the existence of God, or the power of God. And to have this moment where reading the Bible for me, even though I do it academically, it's still a matter of faith. And sometimes the questions and troubles you have are an emblem of that faith that you bring as well. And I think with that, if you look at statements of faith in the Reformed tradition, the Bible isn't necessarily the Word of God, but it's a reflection of the Word of God. And so to understand and to have that posture, this isn't God, but it's a reflection of what God says to us. But within that, there's still so much within there that we can have and feed off and develop in our own faith. Canonical recognition is something that it just allows us to go back into that world and maybe to see the Bible in this. And so the Bible is often very stale. You read it again and again. But to pose the question, there were struggling communities that finally had written word and were fighting to solidify what that was to be for generations to come. And you're actually reading the same text that they read in early Judaism and early Christianity. To understand that literacy was rare, so there was a time when you had to get your proclamation through your father's father, or your husband's father's father, or your husband's father, through that line. And now you have a different level of access. For most of human history, literacy was tiny and small. And for most of human history, there wasn't access to a Bible, much less a gazillion Bibles at your fingertips. And for me, that's something to reflect on that helps me think through what the Bible is and what it means to me today. There are continuous problems in understanding the canon. Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. But what's odd is our earliest Septuagint is earlier than the Hebrew version. And so because the New Testament authors, they quoted from the Septuagint, they quoted from the Greek. And the Septuagint is a little bit different from the Old Testament that you have in translation. And it's pretty obvious that they're taking the Greek and translating from the Hebrew into that. The oldest Septuagint we have is probably about 2nd, 3rd century CE. This was written about the 2nd, 3rd century BCE in a translation from Hebrew into Greek. And there are some words that we could already tell that the Greek writers did not know, so they just transliterate. And one example is Selah in the Psalms. They didn't know what that meant. They just kind of translated that. We still don't know exactly what that means. It needs something to do with rising, probably, whether hands or voices. So the Septuagint, you have a different format, a different order, and actually some different books of the Bible. And the Dead Sea Scrolls is another thing. Thousands of these. Some are Bible, but some are things that sound like the Bible but aren't part of the Bible. Some are texts. There is a text called Jubilees a text called Enoch that might not be in the but for this community, it probably was something really important. And so I really kind of like the problem of the canon, the diversity and fluidity. It wasn't still fixed at this time of the 2nd century BC or even the 1st century CE. All the Torah was reasonably fixed at the time. So why does understanding the canon matter? What is Scripture? How am I to read it? I will ask you the same thing I asked my undergrads at the end of semester, just to think to yourself, in this to the last hour, what is the most important thing you learned? What is the most important? Just kind of keep that note to yourself. What was the most important thing you learned? And a second question, what is a burning question that you have from this last hour? A burning question that you have. So I will talk, it's a completely different thing with the New Testament. It's a completely different set of texts and a different process for canonization. And of course, with less, a smaller group of people making those decisions. Again, we really don't know, but there are certain clues, and I think it influences the way that we understand Scripture. Now, should I be taking questions, or should we just cap this off? We have a few minutes. What do you think is the best way? Take a few. Okay, great. All right. So let's do questions. The hand right away from the very front. Yes, please.
Just one rather long question or quick question, but you think about how a certain group tries to set history, like the political influence on textbooks, or that type of stuff, and you think of canonization like making the textbook for the people, and like when you did that little thing on the Moabs. The spin in the Bible is that the Moabs were the aggressors because when Moses was coming through, they wouldn't let him through, and then Ruth was a Moab, and it was like, ooh, a Moab,
Yeah.
And it said that just did not fit with the spin. Is there a certain amount of, I guess, spin in the marketing to kind of try to, they were all bad and make it black and white when it was really more gray?
Right, absolutely. So remember the Tel Dan Stella and remember the Moabite? Those are really big, like much bigger than my height, like 9 feet tall. How expensive is it to do? And remember, these are on basalt. I want you to imagine writing something perfectly on basalt. How expensive and how skilled you need to be. Scribes were employed by the king at this time, and the king is not just trying to write an objective history for AP World History. They're trying to reaffirm their legitimacy. So the hyperbole you see in the Bible, the greatness of David, that actually follows the known ancient Near Eastern historiography, not as there's a little spin, it is, fair to use the word propaganda, imperial propaganda, in the usage of ancient Near Eastern historiography. I have no problem with that because that's the known genre at the time. And the biblical text is reversing. And Israel, even by its most generous accounts, is a tiny little country in the vast empires of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians. And so it's really reversing. No, it's not the Babylonians. It's the Davidic line. That's super important. So yeah, I would go full on, not just spin, but full on propaganda in a way that fits the time of what they know. And if you go and see, it's not just a writing. If you've had the privilege of going to the British Museum, there's an entire wing of wall reliefs. That it's not just it goes with the iconography, that people walk through these palaces and see, and all the wall reliefs are the same thing. The king getting something great, doing something great. The Coat of Hammurabi is the very top, is the king actually, the king is not the one on the throne, that's the god Marduk. But the king is the one receiving the scepter from Marduk. These are all imperial propaganda, and you can kind of see how the Bible follows that known genre, which makes sense to me. So I would go even harder than you did on that. Yes?
My understanding, too, of as I read in the Old Testament, there's a lot of tension between various books about whether to assimilate others or to as you were saying, send them away. But I mean, you see that in Ruth.
Yep.
And Joshua, who's like, we've got to be purists. Only the Hebrews, I guess.
Yeah. So think about the canonization being a long process. So there's an idea that Ezra Nehemiah was there, but remember, if you are an ethnic group trying to maintain your identity, you have to, sociologically, your identity will disappear in 5 generations. So I married a Korean, happened to, my brother didn't. And my kids, who knows what they'll do. But after 5 generations, you know, people who assimilate will marry outside of their small ethnic designation. And so I'm not saying I like it, but I could see it. If you're going back to a country, you're migrating, you want to preserve that Yahweh worshiping line. And the idea is Ruth was included on the canon as a balance to Nehemiah 10. Like, here's a Moabite woman, and there's no problem with her being foreign. That's not criticized at all. And so the Bible is not systematized, it's narrative. It's not one jurisprudence, but it has tension within there. And sometimes the tension is to assimilate well, and sometimes the tension is to hold on tight to your ethnic identity. And that actually reflects the reality of migrant populations as well. So I think that's a really positive thing. There's a question in the very back there.
Do you think that because it's patrilineal morality, that had a big impact on how, like, for instance, you talked about Asherah, and
Yeah.
then she kind of just disappears, you know, and how, like, what are your thoughts about what we have as canon now and how much we might be missing because it
Yeah.
was such a patriarchal society?
Right, yes, and even right from the start, most scribes were men. Not all of them, but most of them were men. But absolutely, these are passing this a different perspective, which I don't think is something we embrace the morality of. We embrace, actually, this is what the ancient Near East knew. And so because it's passed on patrilineal lens, and there's reasons for that as well. Again, I'm not saying it's morally, but you have to divide your estate in its wholeness. And so it needs to go to the eldest son because that's what keeps the wealth within the family. If it goes to the woman, it will go outside the family. And this is part of the reason why they had the foreign marriage ban as well. But absolutely, you get, the Bible is given to us through that patrilineal descent perspective. So when you read it, you have to take on these are the concerns, and other concerns are going to be more hidden. But I think that necessitates a type of reading to really go into the world of someone like Esther. And she's one, and you're hearing the story refracted through a patrilineal line, and you can kind of see it. So imagine, like, think about someone from a very patrilineal society talking about his daughter. You can't just take it at face value. You have to refract it through what you under. And I think that's good reading of the Bible to understand that as well. And one example is, that Nehemiah. So in Hebrew, when you say men, it actually stands for men and women. And you could actually have grammatically 100 women and 1 man. You'd still use the pronoun for men, or they, masculine at that time. But in Nehemiah 8, it says men and women, which is redundant, which is kind of, I think, emphatic about the entire community. So that's a way that I think very much taking that into account is a reading strategy for the Bible. Yeah.
So on the Septuagint, that's like so important in the New Testament, and like Paul's using it, Luke's using it, but were other Jewish diaspora people, were they using that or not?
No, not as much. A lot of them lost the use of Hebrew at the time.
Okay.
And it makes sense that Paul used it because that's the one that he knew. That's the scripture that they knew at the time. And there was kind of, in the emergence of the Talmud, this reasserting of Hebrew and of course in the Reformation for us, up until the Reformation, they used the Septuagint as what they quoted from, what they drew from. But the Reformation brought us back to Hebrew.
Now, would he have been studying from the Septuagint in Jerusalem when he's with? Yeah.
He would be bilingual. And because he was someone in the priestly class, he would have been trained in Torah. So by the time of Jesus, there was a certain resurgence of Hebrew. What's super interesting is a lot of people didn't read Hebrew, but they had it on coins. And they had, just like E pluribus, there's Latin in our coins. And so there was something that was very nationalistic about the resurgence of Hebrew. People lost it from long ago, but it came back at some point as a point of nationalistic identity. The same thing happened in the 19th and 20th century in European history as well.
But in the synagogues, those tablets like that Christ read, or like what Matthew would have quoted, that would have been.
Matthew quoted in the Septuagint. But there are certain parts in Hebrew and Aramaic. And one great example is Jesus was a native Aramaic speaker. And you probably know on the cross, he said, Lama lama sabachthani. That's actually in Aramaic. And so in the most vulnerable moment, he's crying in his native language in that translation of the Hebrew, which is an amazing cross theology right there. And yeah, I feel like I'm ignoring what's that. If you're undergrads, I would solicit more aggressively from this side. Oh, okay. There's one here? Yeah.
No, I said we all know everything.
Okay, yeah, that's good, yeah. I actually consulted them before this morning to make sure I'm right on things.
So my question is, I, again, look at some of the, both current context and Old Testament. You've got Abraham, who's made a migration, from Babylon or that area, down to what we now see as Israel. And later, you have the Israelites coming back from Egypt to that area. And I guess I'm wondering, is there all these frequent comments about the promise, this is God's promise to us? Is that their justification? Because there were other peoples there at the time.
Yeah, this is a really, I know you have service soon, so I'm going to give like the shortest, most concise answer. You have to realize Israel is tiny. By its narrative, these are a group of escaped slaves from Egypt, or someone who leaves everything in Babylon. Like they're migrating all the time, they're migrating on the hardest of circumstances. And promise to someone who's economically marginalized is something different from promise to someone who's already rich. And it means not I'm going to become massively wealthy, but I'm going to have enough to sustain my family in relative abundance of land. There's no money at the time of Abraham. There's actually no money at the Old Testament except 2 mentions in Ezra and Chronicles. There's a Derek. But it is, so when you take those promises and you apply them today to the Western world, which has the capacity for unlimited wealth, there's something hermeneutically problematic about that. And I think that's part of the reason where in the Old Testament, almost every time God promises blessing, it's material blessing. It's land, it's progeny, it's a forever house and kingdom. And Jesus does something different. And I think part of my little argument is that by the time of the Romans, you have you have money. You have the capacity of greed that you never had before. You have the capacity of hoarding that you never had before. You can't be greedy if there's no money. You just have your land. You need to have seeding to work at but that capacity is increased. And that's, I don't think Jesus is saying something different, but just contextualizing this idea of relying on God in a way that was already very present for the Old Testament lands. But I think that is great to talk about next week as well, how we can understand these New Testament texts differently from how the Old Testament canon came to be. Yeah, great. Well, thank you.